All right, Rabbi, say good morning. Let us begin. So we are picking up Emir Hashem. We are picking up. Let me just find our sponsorships. I want to begin by thanking our sponsorships. Our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Adar. Paul and Kathy Pollack for dedicating all of the Shiurim and Drushos this month in memory of Paul's grandparents, Dina Bas Pesach and Zechariah ben Zechariah. We thank our Daf Yomi sponsors for today, Gabi and Shana Cohn, for dedicating the shir this morning commemoration of the yahrzeit of Gabi's grandfather, Alvin Cohn, Avram ben Rabbi Yaakov HaKohen. We thank Ellen Keon Zager for dedicating the shir this morning in memory of Sammy Keon, Shlomo ben Reb David HaKohen, Ellen's father of blessed memory, on the occasion of his 12th yahrzeit, whose love of learning only increased with age. Truly beautiful. We thank David and Chani Katz for dedicating the shir this morning on the occasion of the yahrzeit of their beloved sister and sister-in-law, Ruth Whiskey Rus Bas Yosef, Zichron Livracha. We thank Alan Wiseman for dedicating the shir this morning, and here's his dedication. I boarded the Daf Yomi train 2 cycles ago during Pesachim, and thank you for the amazing ride. Incredible. Alan and Hashem, many more years together. And we thank Moshe and Chavi Abramson for dedicating the parak of Arvei Pesachim in the Zechus of Refuah Shalima for Daniel Meir ben Chana. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all those who require a refuah should have one together with Kol Chol Yisrael. All of the neshama should have an aliyah, and the families ein chama. We'll say with that, I thank very much all of our sponsors. It's beautiful to see the ongoing generosity of so many. Thank you all. We'll say with that, let us begin. So today's daf is Kuftes, a very exciting Gemara ahead of us today. We're going to pick up Emir Hashem on Kuf Chesamud Beis 108b, and we're picking up 3 lines up from the bottom. Tan Rabbanan. So we'll say Kol Chayovim Ba'arba Kosos Halalu Echad Noshim Ve'echad Anoshim Ve'echad Noshim Ve'echad Tinokos. Everyone is Chayv in Arba Kosos. Right? Everyone has to drink 4 cups. So I'm supposed to remember again. We saw in yesterday's daf that women are Chayavos because Afhin Hayu Ba'os Sahanis. So we saw that already. Now the Gemara is adding in men. We already understood, and the Gemara adds in over here children as well. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, why would you make children obligated in Arba Kosos? After all, what benefit of wine is there to children? So if you take a look at the Rashbam says, first of all, why would you go ahead and include children in Dalet Kosos? So the Rashbam says, because Shegam Hein Nigalu. Ultimately, you get because they were Afhina Yubal Sanis. They were also redeemed. So Rabbi Yehuda says, I don't understand. What benefit of there is there in giving wine to children? Now, what Rabbi Yehuda, according to Rashba, means is as follows. Halo P'trum in Amitzos. So Rabbi Yehuda says, I don't understand. What do you mean that children are Chayavim in Arba Kosos? At the end of the day, children are Pater from Mitzvos. So what are you talking about? Rather, the Gemara says, Ella mechalkin lohen top of koftes klayos ve'egozin be'erev Pesach. But rather, again, what we do is we go ahead and we distribute to them klayos and egozin. Klayos is parched grain. Egozin are nuts. We give them to them on erev Pesach. Kedei shelo yishanu, in order that the children not go to sleep. V'yishalu, and they should ask questions over the course of the seder. So both say. So comes along Rabbi Yehuda. And Rabbi Yehuda says like this: children, of course, are not obligated in Dalet Kosos, right? But the idea is that we want the children to remain engaged in the Seder. How do you say now again? Where does this mandate come from? Because remember again, the Torah itself, when it frames the Pesach experience, says Ki yeshalcha bincha machar lemor ma ha'avod hazos lachem. So the way the Torah frames this Pesach experience is Ki yeshalcha bincha. Your child will ask you. Well, in order for my child to ask me, what the prerequisite to that is? The child has to be awake. Okay, so that's why again, it's just saying the Havamina of the Gemara. The Havamina of the Gemara is okay. So keep the children engaged. How do you keep the children engaged? Arba Kosos. So This says, no, it doesn't make sense. Arba Kosos is a mitzvah, and children are not chayavim in mitzvahs. So how do you keep the children engaged? You give them candy, or at least the Talmudic form of candy. Right? You go ahead and give them parched grain, give them nuts, keep them engaged in order that they not fall asleep and they ask at the Seder. Amru alava Rabbi Akiva. So we'll say this is so beautiful. They said about Rabbi Akiva, Shahayim mechalik klayos ve'egozim litinokos b'erev Pesach. Well, let's listen to this. Rabbi Akiva was the Talmudic candyman. Right? So what would he do? He was the Erev Pesach candyman. And he would go ahead and Erev Pesach give out klayos and egozim, parched grain and nuts to the children. Kedei shelo yishanu v'yishalu. In order that ultimately, again, they should not fall asleep, and ultimately, again, ask the question. They will say, I just think it's very striking that this is Rabbi Akiva. This is Rabbi Akiva. So why is it Rabbi Akiva who's handing out the candy on Erev Pesach to keep the children awake? So you'll say the whole chap over here is, don't fall asleep. Don't fall asleep. You know, Rabbi Akiva knows what it's like to sleep through a chelik of life. Right? Because Rabbi Akiva didn't find Torah until he was 40 years old. He slumbered through the first 4 decades of his life. He knows how much you can miss out when you go ahead and you just sleepwalk through life. And Rabbi Akiva made it his life mission that the children shouldn't sleepwalk through life. The children ultimately, again, should be awake. I will say, it's such an incredible yisod, because whether we recognize it or not, we often sleepwalk through life. We go through the motions, we go through our day, we're like the hamster on the wheel, and we think we're making traction, we think we're going, but sometimes we're not really moving ourselves in the comprehensive way we need to. So Rabbi Akiva said, have to make sure the children don't fall asleep, because children who fall asleep can chas v'shalom become adults who fall asleep. And adults who fall asleep can miss out on so much in life. So Rabbi Akiva used to hand out the klayos and that goes in on Erev Pesach. Tanya, both say this is beautiful. Tanya, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, chotfin matzos belele Pesach, b'shil tinoko shlo yishana. So we'll say, fascinating statement. So comes along Rabbi Eliezer and agrees with this idea that we have to go ahead and keep the children awake, right? The goal is you can't let the children fall asleep. We want the children to be engaged at the Seder. So what would they do? Chotfin matzos. Now chotfin matzos literally means they would grab the matzos. Now what does this mean? If you take a look at the Rashbam, this is fascinating. It says, Chotfin matzos. He says, Magbina sakara, b'shil tinoko shishalu. So, first approach in the Rashbam, which is also the approach in Rashi, you take away the Seder plate. We do strange things at the Seder in order that the children say, hey, what's going on? So we'll say, Chotfin matzah means that ultimately you lift up the Seder plate. Now, why do they call the Seder plate lifting up matzah? Because remember, again, we're going to discuss this, but bepashtos, the matzahs are part of the Seder plate. So when you go ahead and you lift up the Seder plate, you remove the matzahs as well. Ve'este mefarshi, chotfin matzah, ochlin maher, shnei l'shonos ala perush rabbeinu. Or the other possibilities, chotfin matzah means we eat quickly. We'll define what that means in just a moment. Ve'ish karsin, matzos, magbin asakara, sheish ba matzah marav beis tavshilin. So I just want to point out, there are different types of Seder plates that people have. Right? So some people you have a Seder plate, and then you keep your matzahs separate from the Seder plate. It appears from the Rashbam and Rashi that the Seder plate they used to use was a Seder plate that sat on top of the matzahs, which is really quite interesting. So like the largest, a lot of people have a Seder plate like this. You have the Seder plate on top, the matzahs rest under it. This seems to be, and I want to point out, this is not a halachic issue. This is more just a fascinating practice issue, that it just, from the Lashon, that when they say chotfin es hamatzos, you remove the matzahs, that refers to the ka'ara, to the Seder plate. That's what it sounds like, the type of Seder plate they had. Velinira, and listen to this, Rashbam says, I think, Velinira, chotfin misalkin es halechem miyad hatinokos, shelo yu yishenem mitoch ma'achal harbe, kederach hatinok acher achilaso, v'shuv lo yishalu, aval achshav kishechotfin mehen lo yishnu, v'yishalu, kilomar lo yishan shelo ocham. Let's listen to this. So the Rashbam says, however, I think that what it means is as follows. I think what it means is we don't let the kids eat a lot during the Seder. Chotfin es hamatzos literally means we grab the matzah out of their hand. That we don't let them eat too much. Because what happens when you eat too much? What happens when you eat too much? You get tired. It will say it's not an accident that for many the second part of the Seder is much more challenging than the first, right? Because I mean from I was going to say wokeness, but you can't say that today, right? From a wakefulness perspective, right? So it's why? Because again, I just had a big meal. So of course the second part. So Chotfin es hamatzos says Rashbam, and later on he quotes the Tosefta. says that what it means is we don't let the kids eat too much over the course of the Seder. We go ahead and we grab the matzah. So we'll say, so a number of different versions. Either it could mean we eat quickly, or it could mean we remove the Seder plate, or it means that we don't let the kids eat too much. Now I will say, what I do want to point out is that many quote this Gemara to be the source of the minhag of stealing the afikomen. Chotfin es hamatzas. We grab the matzah. We grab the matzah. Mishnah Berurah quotes this as well. Chotfin es hamatzas. We grab the matzahs, stealing the afikomen. Now I want to point out, maybe we'll find the time to talk more about this. A lot to talk about still before Pesach. Many are against this practice of stealing the afikomen. Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach Zecher Tzadik Livracha has a piece on this where he writes that it's bad midos. It's just bad midos. Why in a million years would we ever teach our children to steal and then extort, right? It's theft and extortion, right? It's I'm going to steal the afikomen, and by the way, if you want it back, here's what you have to do. So Shlomo Zalman says, what terrible midos to instill within our children at the Leil HaSeder. Okay, but we understand a lot, many other accept this practice as a minhag Yisrael. And again, it's rooted in the Gemara Chotfin. We grab the matzah. So both say, so essentially 4 different approaches. Either it could be referring to stealing the afikomen, or it could be referring ultimately to lifting up the Seder plate, or it could mean we eat quickly, which I both say, eat quickly, or it means that halacha l'maisa, we don't let the kids eat too much. Just the eating quickly piece, I'll just mention as an aside that if you're leading a Seder, and whether it's other people there or whether it's children there, it is so important to be strategic in how you run your Seder. You know, that sometimes for the benefit of the children, it's kedai to do a faster Seder. If you could keep your children engaged by moving things along and they could find it exciting, the goal of your Pesach Seder, I can't tell you how many people have traumatic childhood memories from the Leil HaSeder. Right? A Seder that went on too long, my father made me sit at the table. The goal of the Seder is not to scar your child. The goal of the Seder ultimately is that your child should emerge from it and say, this was incredible. And sometimes that means you gotta move fast. And sometimes it means you're not saying a Devar Torah to every single thing. And sometimes it means you read a little less from the Haggadah, but tell a few more stories or sing a few more nigunim, depending on the temperament of your mishpacha and your children. So incredibly important to be strategic in how you run your Seder to make it an engaging experience. So again, we see that often the Gemara Chot V'nes HaMatzos. So the Gemara goes weiter. The Gemara says, Tanya Amar Rabbi Akiva. Bossi, this is great. Once again, Rabbi Akiva. They started with Rabbi Akiva. Miyamav lo Amar Higia Eis Lamonu Beis HaMedrash. Rabbi Akiva never said it's time to leave the Beis Medrash. So Bossi, this was the hallmark of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva never left the Beis Medrash, and certainly he never made an announcement. Okay, closing time for everybody to go home, except for twice a year. When was that? Chutz mi Arvei Pesachim ve'Erev Yom Kippurim, except for Erev Pesach and Erev Yom Kippur. Erev Pesach b'shvil hatinokos kedei shelo yishanu. So I will say on Erev Pesach he would send the men home from the Beis Medrash. Why? Ultimately, again, so that the children should not sleep at night. So I will say Rashbam points out over here, so that the fathers should encourage their children to take a nap on Erev Pesach, so that they will be well rested for the Pesach Seder. Rashbam says, "Kedei sheyishanu es hatinokos bayom v'lo balayla b'shas haggadah. Inami kishem akvin ad alayla achar shechishim hatinokos." So we'll say, so by the Rashbam says it could also mean that Rabbi Akiva encouraged people to go home from the Beis Medrash immediately after davening on Yom Tov night, and not to linger in the Beis Medrash, because then the concern would be that by the time they got home, their kids would be asleep. Okay, but I think the first approach is quite fascinating, that Rabbi Akiva was telling the men in the Beis Medrash on Erev Pesach, go home and help, and specifically help with the kids. Help with the kids, make sure the kids take a nap. This way, again, they are ready to go ahead and participate in the Seder. And similarly, Erev Yom Kippurim, Kadei Sheachilu Es B'neihem. Erev Yom Kippur, in order that they give their children something to eat. Because you must remember, again, there is a mitzvah to eat, mitzvah d'oraisa, to eat on Erev Yom Kippur. So Rabbi Akiva never sent anyone home from the Beis Medrash except on Erev Yom Kippur and Erev Pesach. Beautiful. Tan Rabbanon. So we'll say, Chayiv Adam l'sameach barav u'bnei beiso b'regel. Person is obligated to be misameach, to give joy to his children and to the members of his household on Yom Tiv. Shene Emar, v'samachta b'chagecha. The pasuk says, "You shall rejoice on your holiday, on your Yom Tiv." So how do you make the members of your household happy on Yom Tiv? So the Gemara says, "Biyayin." With wine. Wine makes everybody happy. Rabbi Yehuda says no. Rabbi Yehuda says, Anoshim b'roi lahem, v'noshim b'roi lahem. Everybody has different things that make them happy. So the men have things that make them happy. The men have things that make them happy. Anoshim b'roi lahem b'yayin. So for men, wine works well. V'noshim b'roi lahem. And for women, you have to give them, what is it, I'm sorry. So, Anashim b'roi lahem b'yayin, v'noshim b'mai, how do you make women happy? Tani Rav Yosef, b'vavel. So the answer is, we don't know. Right? But again, but the Gemara says, Tani Rav Yosef, but Rav Yosef ventures a guess on this, and he says, Tani Rav Yosef, bebavel bebigdei tzivonin. Ultimately, again, in Bavel, they would give the women colored clothing. Be'eretz Yisrael bebigdei pishtan miguhatzin. And in Eretz Yisrael, linen pressed clothing. Okay, clothing. Okay, so Bavel and Eretz Yisrael, they had different fashion styles. But Lamaisa, again, clothing. Tanya Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira Omer. So both say again. So this is really quite fascinating. I just want to mention a fascinating machlokes about this. So both say. So what comes out over here is the Gemara's understanding that v'samachta b'chagecha is a din that I have to be misameach my family. In other words, not only do I have an obligation to go ahead and be besimcha, but ultimately, again, I have an obligation to be misameach my family. And again, the Gemara says, how do you bring joy to your family? Okay, so wine, clothing, men, women. So I'll tell you something absolutely amazing. So there's a machlokes between the Rambam and the Ravid as to whether or not a woman has a mitzvahs aseh of the samachta bechagecha. Does a woman have, because we'll say, if you look at the Gemara over here, the way the Gemara frames a woman's obligation of the samachta bechagecha is how? That her husband has an obligation to be misameach her. So there's a machlokus about whether or not a woman has a standalone machlokus of v'samachta bechagecha. Let's say a woman's not married. So there's no husband in the picture to make her happy. Does she have a biblical obligation of v'samachta bechagecha or not? So the Rambam says, the Rambam paskins, the Isha Mitzuva ala Simcha. That's how the Rambam paskins in Hilchos Yomtiv. Perek Vav Halacha Yud Zayin. Vav Yud Zayin Hilchos Yomtiv. The Rambam paskins, a woman has an obligation of V'samachta alagach Bechagecha, a biblical obligation. Now, interestingly enough, the Ravid disagrees. The Ravid says, the Isha quotes over, actually quotes the Gemara from Yidushin, the Isha Baila Misamcha. So the Ravid disagrees with the Rambam, and the Ravid says a woman does not have an individual obligation of Simcha. Instead, her obligation is that her husband makes her happy. The al habal mutal hachiyuv l'simcha, aval he eino chiyuv baseh. So we'll say this is right. So the Ravid says, no, a woman does not have a biblical obligation of v'samachta bechagecha. Rather, the obligation is that her husband must make her happy. So we'll say this is so now listen to this, because this is absolutely incredible. Rabbi Akiva Eger has a whole piece on this, and he discusses. So we'll say, so I have the Rambam who says that a woman has her own independent obligation of v'samachta bechagecha. I then have the Ravid, I'm saying that's the Rambam. A Ravid says, no, a woman doesn't have an obligation of v'samachta bechagecha. Rather, her obligation, her simcha, is an obligation upon her husband. So we'll say, Rabbi Akiva Eger says, well, what does that mean? What does that mean that the husband has an obligation for her simcha? So there are two possibilities about it. Is it afim tzarich lidok shelo titztar klal b'chag, or the kol chiyuv l'samcha kam pamim b'chag v'chol she'asa kin yatzeh dechovaso. However, ach lo tzarich l'shom shelo tzar. Listen to this. If you go according to the Ravid, that a husband has an obligation to make his wife happy, to be misameach her, what does that mean? Does that mean that he has to ensure that she has no tsar, that she has no discomfort or sadness over Yom Tiv? Or is it that he just has to go out of his way to do something nice for her over the course of the day? We'll say here this chakira is the husband's obligation to ensure that his wife is not bitsa'ar over Yom Tiv, that she's not suffering, having a difficult time. Is that his obligation? Or is just simply to go ahead and give her, we'll call it episodic simcha, to go ahead and do nice things, clothing, jewelry, wine, whatever it is. So we'll say, so again, Rabbi Akiva Eger doesn't really answer this. He just brings down this fascinating chakira. But I will say, when I was thinking about this, that what a fundamental life machlokes. First of all, the machlokes in the Rambam and the Ravid in general is, can you ever be responsible for someone else's happiness? So the Rambam says, everyone is responsible for their own happiness. I will say, the most dangerous thing in life is when you make your happiness dependent on another. I'll be happy when, or I'll be happy if. People who hinge their personalistic happiness on either someone else doing something or something else occurring, it's so dangerous. First of all, because then you give up the reins over your own happiness. Happiness is a choice, says the Rambam. Therefore, a woman has a mitzvahs aseh of v'samachta bechagecha. It's true, a husband has to help facilitate it. That's the Gemara saying. But at the end of the day, your simcha is your choice. No one else could be responsible for your happiness. The Ravid says, that's not true. That's not true. You can be responsible for other people's simcha, but the Ravid seems to be saying, this is incredible. The Ravid seems to be saying is, the most I could do for someone else is give them, we'll call it moments of joy. I could do things for them, but I cannot remove someone else's tsar. Right? I could go ahead and do nice things for you, which hopefully generate a sense of simcha. But to remove your tsar in life, that I can't do. That's ultimately, again, going to be up to you and you alone. But I will say, what an incredible machlokes about life happiness. Can life happiness be achieved through another, or is life happiness a personal choice that I have to make? Rambam, everyone must choose to be happy or not. That is an individual decision. Ravid, not true. You could take responsibility for someone else's simcha. Dramatic life machlokes. Anyway, let's go back. Says the Gemara, Tana Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira Omer, Bizman shebeis, so incredible. Bizman shebeis hamikdash kayom. I will say, just when I say these things, you should know. When I don't have time really to be marich in it, but they're good marimakomos to follow up on. You know, there's so much beautiful Torah embedded in every line of Gemara. And remember, as I often say, so in general, Gemara and Halacha is not just how Chazal teach us what to do and what not to do. It's how Chazal teach us the most profound life lessons. You just have to scratch a little bit beneath the surface to be able to find anything and everything. So the Gemara says, Hafach ba hafach ba dekula ba. Literally turn it over, everything is inside of it. So the Gemara goes weiter. The Gemara says, Tanya Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira Omer, Bizman shebeis hamikdash kayim ein simcha ela b'basar. When the Beis Hamikdash stood, simcha is found in basar. Right? In other words, you fulfill the mitzvah of simcha with meat. Shene'amar v'zavachta shlamim v'achalta sham v'samachta v'fnei Hashem elokecha. Because the pasuk says, you shall offer up your shlamim, you shall eat it there, and you shall rejoice before Hashem. So we'll say, you see over here that the Torah links simcha with karbanos. So clearly indicating to us that halacha l'maisa, when the Beis Hamikdash stands, so simcha can be found in meat. Again, I want to be clear, it's sacrificial meat, in karbanos. Achshav she'en Beis Hamikdash kayom, but now that the Beis Hamikdash does not stand, ein simcha ela b'yayin. There is no simcha except wine. Shene'emar v'yayin yisamach levav enosh. Because the pasuk says that wine will gladden the heart of man. So we'll say, it struck me when looking at this Gemara, I don't understand. Why can't you have the same simcha through meat? In other words, meat is meat is meat. I got it when the Beis Hamikdash stood. So say again, there's karbanos. But again, it's the same meat. So if, again, if you would have told me that during the Beis Hamikdash time, simcha is derived from the miracles in the Beis Hamikdash, or simcha is derived from aliyah l'regel. Okay, I would understand. We don't have those things yet. But lamaisa meat, we have plenty of meat today. So why can't it be the same simcha for meat? So perhaps what the Gemara is saying is as follows. What the Gemara is saying is, in the absence of the Beis Hamikdash, reality has changed. And this is an incredibly important yesod. The absence of the Beis Hamikdash is not just the absence of a structure. The entire reality of the world has changed. The entire dynamic of the human condition has changed. So when the Beis Hamikdash was here, the karbanos, which represent, again, the bridge between heaven and earth, the karbanos, which represents taking the material, lifting it up, that was the source of my simcha, because the karban, from Lashon of Karav, that's the way I came close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. There was a direct physical mechanism to serve as a bridge between myself and my Father. That was the simcha. Now there's no Beis Hamikdash. The reality has been altered. I will say, what's the power of wine? What's the power of wine? The power of wine is the ability to see beyond your reality. I don't mean to delude yourself. I will say the power of wine allows you to step back from yourself a little bit and to step back from your circumstances, right? Wine allows you to see many wonderful things. First of all, wine allows you to see many wonderful things in people that you often can't see without wine. That's the one. And wine allows you to see many incredible things in life that it just help when it says Yain Samach Levav Enosh, because wine opens the heart. So the Gemara is saying over here like this: with the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, the world, the human condition, everything has been compromised. And sometimes it's difficult to see the simcha in life, and it's difficult to see the simcha in the world, and it's difficult to see how we're supposed to create a bridge with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, without the meat, without the carbon. But wine comes along, and wine allows me to see beyond my current reality and to just see a little bit bigger. This is why I both say every single religious service we have is rooted in wine. Why is that? Why is that? I want to point out, it's from cradle to grave. We don't have it anymore, but the Gemara Maseches Moekan points out that they used to have an interesting practice. When they came back from the Levaya, you know what they would have? It's called the Kos Shel Tanchumin, cup of consolation. You know what the cup of consolation is? It's the biggest cup of wine you've ever seen, right? That's the cup of consolation, right? Why? The Gemara says, we'll say, but I want to be clear. It's not to drown your sorrows, right? It's not as an escape. But Chazal understood that when a person endures loss, their world comes crumbling down. And the more traumatic and tragic the loss, the less hope a person has. A person thinks the world is over. The world is not over. No matter how tragic or traumatic a loss, your world is never over. But sometimes I can't see that. But the power of wine is that a little bit, again, everything in moderation, a little bit of wine has the ability to allow me to take a step back from myself and to see the much bigger picture. So that's true by Dalet Kos. That's why, again, it's true by Dalet Koses, it's true by Kiddush, it's true by everything, and it's also true even, again, by death. So the Gemara, therefore, the Gemara says that which sacrificial meat accomplished when the Beis Hamikdash stood, because that meat defined the reality of my times. The carbon, the closeness, and the absence of the Beis Hamikdash. Wine allows me to take a step back from a sometimes challenging reality, see the good that is in myself, see the good that is in the world, see the good that is with another, and stoke the fire, the anticipatory fire of Geula as well. So the Gemara goes weiter. Amar Rav Yitzchak. We'll say, so now a little bit of a technical conversation regarding measurements. Kasta de Morisa Davi Betzipori. So the Kasta de Morisa, the Rashbam points out over here, Mida Shemochrin Bohamorias. This was a particular weight or measure which they used to use in order to measure out, the kishkas of fish kishkas, right? Morias literally means it was like a dish that was made from fish innards. So the Kasta de Morisa, the measurement for the Morisa, for the fish innards that was in Sipori, Hava Kamin Luga de Mikdasha. That was the same size as the lug measurement in the Beis Hamikdash. Uba Misharon Revi'ah Shal Pesach. And Abosai, with that, you can go ahead and measure out a Revi'ah for Pesach. So Abosai, remember again, for the Dalit Kosos, essentially what you would do is you would take a lug of wine concentrate, you would divide that into four, right? So you'd have a quarter of a lug. We'll say quarter of a lug per cup is what we call a revi'us. That's why, again, remember, the ratio for making a proper cup of Talmudic wine was one revi'us wine concentrate, 3 parts water. Amar Rav Yochanan, Tamnia Kadmaisa Dahava B'Tveria. The Tamnia Kadmaisa. So again, the Rashbam says is Mida. This was the name of a measurement. So the original Tamniasa that was in Tveria, Hava Yisera al Da Revia, was 1 revi'us larger than this Kasta de Morisa. Uba Misharin Revi'as Shal Pesach, and it was through this that they would measure out the lug, ultimately again of wine concentrate for Pesach. Amar Rav Chisda, Revi'as Shal Torah, the size of a biblical revi'as is etzba'ayim al etzba'ayim berum etzba'ayim, is ultimately again 2 finger breadths. By 2 finger breadths long, by 2 finger breadths wide, by 2 finger breadths, berum etzba'ayim, v'chatzi etzba v'chomesh etzba, and then a half plus a fifth of a finger breadth in height. That's the size. I guess if you want to see like the what's the word? Surface area of a revi'us, that would be it. 2 finger breadths long by 2 finger breadths wide by 2 finger breadths high, with an additional half and a fifth finger breadths. Okay? Kedesanya, Verachatz Bisara B'mayim. The pasuk says, you will wash his flesh in water. So we'll say, this is referring to a mikvah. Right? When we speak about a mikvah, so a mikvah has to be large enough, ultimately, again, to immerse all of your flesh. Basically, the Gemara says, Verachatz Bisara B'mayim. So I'm sorry, Verachatz Bisaro, Shelo Yehei Davar Chotes Bein Bisara L'mayim. Teaches me that Allah L'mayim there could be no chatzitza between myself and the water. So the both say, that's learned out from Verachatz Bisara B'mayim. Your entire body must come into the water. There can be no chatzitzas between yourself and the water. B'mayim b'mei mikvah. Water means the water of a mikvah. Es kol bisaro. And what does it mean? You have to immerse all of your flesh. Mayim shekol gufa ola bahen. The mikvah has to be large enough to immerse your entire body inside of it. So we'll say, so number of very interesting halachas over here. First of all, mayim means mikvah. Number two, b'mayim teaches me no chatzitzas, nothing interposing between my body and the water. And number three, it has to be a body of water that is large enough for you to go ahead and immerse your entire body at once. B'kamahin, and how much water is that? To which the Gemara says, Amud Beis, Amma al Amma berum shalosh amos. It is 1 amma by 1 amma with a height of 3 amos. And I've also said, V'shi'aru chachamim shir me mikvah arba'im sa. And Chazal said, by the way, the size of that mikvah, is the amount of water necessary to satisfy that criteria to immerse the entire body at once is 40 sa. 40 sa. So we'll say, so just to give you the measurements, so remember, we approximately, just these are approximations, but let's assume for a moment that 1 sa is about 14.3 liters. 14.3 liters, which we need then that 40 sa is 575 liters, or just to give you other illustrated purpose, 150 gallons. 150 gallons. So 150 gallons, again, these are approximate amounts, but 150 gallons would be approximately 40 sa'ah, which is in the eyes of Chazal, the amount of water necessary for an average person to be able to immerse their body in its entirety. Incredible. Amr Ravash, based on this, Amr li Ravin Bar Chinena, Shulchan Shal Mikdash Shal Prakim Hava. It must be that the shulchan of the Beis HaMikdash was made of parts, was made of pieces. Now, both say. Now, remember again, we're assuming right now that the most basic size of a mikvah is an amma by amma with a height of 3 ammas. Now, the shulchan itself was an amma wide. So the Gemara says it must be that the shulchan was made in pieces. Because if the shulchan wasn't made in pieces, then what? You can't immerse a kli that's an amma inside of a mikvah that's an amma. Now, the Rashbam has a whole discussion over here about the shulchan becoming tamei, whether it can become tamei. We're not going to get into it, but what I will tell you is as follows: that the Gemara quotes the idea, the Rashbam quotes this Gemara, they quotes the idea that by the Oli Regalim, right, when the Oli Regalim would come, they would often go, the Kohanim would often carry out the shulchan to show the shulchan to the people. And they would say, Ru'uchi basam l'fnei hamakom, see how beloved you are in front of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. They would show them the miracle of the lechem hapanim, that it stayed fresh. So the Gemara discusses that after Aliyah L'Regel, they would often immerse many of the utensils of the Beis HaMikdash. Why? Because there were people around. So because there are people around, people touch stuff, right? That's what often happens. So therefore they would immerse everything. So the Gemara just says over here that in Masiyat, the shulchan was made of pieces, was made of parts. Because halach l'maisa, otherwise, if the shulchan is an amma, a kli that's an amma doesn't fit into a mikveh that's an amma. To which the Gemara says, because if you know that the shulchan is one cohesive piece, amsa ba'amsa heichim etable, how can you immerse something that is 1 amma by 1 amma in a mikvah that is 1 amma by 1 amma? To which the Gemara says, come on, my question, why is that a question? Dilma biyam sha'asa shlomo havamat biolei. So we'll say, remember again, why are you assuming that the mikvah in the mikdash was a minimum sheer mikvah? Why do you make that assumption that the mikvah in the Beis HaMikdash was in 1 amma by 1 amma mikvah? Why would you assume that? It's just as possible that they used to immerse everything. We'll say what they called the Yam Shel Shlomo. The Yam Shel Shlomo was a massive water basin that Shlomo Melech constructed. Now the truth is, Shlomo Melech constructed it for a totally different purpose, because at night what they used to do is, I will say technically speaking, they had a kior. The kior was a very large wash basin, right? It was a very large receptacle that had spigots. They filled it with water. The Kohanim used it for kiddush raglayim, sanctification of hands and feet. Technically speaking, any water which would remain in the kiyur would become pasul overnight because of lina. Anything you leave over in the Beis Hamikdash overnight becomes pasul with lina, staying overnight. So what they used to have to do is they would have to empty out and refill the kiyur. Shlomo Melech coming up with an incredible idea. He created this thing that they later called the Yam Shel Shlomo, the Sea of Shlomo, together with a whole complex pulley system where they would essentially hoist up the kiyur, lowering it down into the Yam Shel Shlomo at night. Therefore, it was essentially immersed in water, so they wouldn't have to go ahead and refill the kiyur every single time. I don't know. That sounds much more complicated than just refilling the kiyur. But again, obviously, it wasn't. That's what they decided. So we'll say, so that Yam Shel Shlomo also functioned as a mikvah. It also functions as a mikvah. So Gemara says, I don't understand. Why would you assume that the mikvah used in the mikdash was an amma by amma? All the Gemara is just highlighting over here is that the minimum shear for a mikvah would be an amma by an amma with a height of 3 ammas. That's all. But why? It's just as easy to assume that the amma they used in the Beis Hamikdash was the Yam Shel Shlomo. After all, the Gemara says, because the Tana B'chia, Yam She'asa Shlomo machzik 150 mikvah taira. Because the Esar B'chia says that the Yam that Shlomo made, which is literally this large basin, this large mikvah, held 100 and the size of 150 mikvahs. 150 mikvahs. So we'll say all the Gemara says over here is that halacha l'maisa. The Yam again, you don't have to get into the idea. In other words, it's possible that the shulchan was a solid piece. That is even possible. But halacha l'maisa, again, there was still plenty of room to immerse it in the Yam Shel Shlomo. Beautiful. We'll say back to Pesachim. V'lo yifches solo me'arba. So we'll say, so interesting. We'll say now we're going to get into a really interesting discussion here. So remember again, the Mishnah spoke about the idea that there's dalet kosos, right? 4 cups of wine. And the Mishnah said dalet kosos is so important that even an ani, right? Even if a person is poor, so halacha l'maisa, you have to go and make sure that he has what he needs for dalet kosos. So we'll say the Gemara says, Heichi mitakni rabbanon midi di asi liba lidei sakana. So I'll say the Gemara asks a very interesting question. We now get into the concept of zugos. So we'll get a little bit more into this in just a moment. We'll say zugos is the concept that we don't do things in pairs. We don't do things in pairs. So we'll say why? Because apparently when you do things in pairs, ultimately it opens up a person to some type of mystical sakana. Some type of mystical danger, shadim, other things like that. So we'll say this topic of zugos is a hotly contested one, right? Whether or not do we believe in this kind of stuff, not believe in this kind of stuff, Machlokes Rambam and the Ramban. We're just going to go with a basic understanding of zugos, which is one that's adopted by many, the Ben Yehoyada, even the Rabbi Nebachia, who explain essentially ideas like this. The concept of zugos, doing things in pairs, seems to go ahead and smack of the concept of dualism, right? Dualism, the belief in more than one God, right? Or the belief in, opposite forces of good and evil. I want to think about this just a moment. Even if you think about it, how our concept of Gehenna differs from the Christian concept of hell, right? Because the Christian concept of hell is often rooted in a concept that deals with the devil, right? The devil having almost like an independent shlita than God. We don't believe in this concept. We believe there's only one power, the Ribbon Shalom. That's it. Everything comes from the Ribbon Shalom. So this concept of zugos, doing things in pairs, leaving one susceptible to danger, seems to be a concern that if you do things in pairs, if you do things in zugos, ultimately, again, it could feel like a person is subscribing to this notion of dualism. So we'll just go with that general approach. So the Gemara says as follows. The Gemara says, so how could the rabbis go ahead and institute something? So Chazal instituted Dalet Kosos. So how could Chazal institute Dalet Kosos when Dalet Kosos is 2 pairs? Right? Isn't a person putting themselves in, or aren't the rabbis putting us in sakana? We'll discuss in tomorrow's daf the actual sakana of zugos. V'atanya, we learned, lo yochal adam trei, v'lo yishta trei. Person should not drink in units of 2. Person should not go and eat in units of 2. V'lo yikaneach trei. Now we'll discuss what this means, but literally what it sounds like is a person should not relieve themselves in units of 2. V'lo yaset tzrachav trei, or a person should not engage in relations in units of 2, meaning 2 acts of relations, right? It's saying you shouldn't do things in units of 2. So the Gemara says, so I will say why? Because of this fear, because of this danger of zugos. Look at the Rashbam. So the Rashbam says, not yet. So the Gemara, Amar Kra, Leil Shimur. So let's say to which the Gemara, first answer, zugos is not a problem on Pesach night. Why is zugos not a problem on Pesach night? Because Pesach night is referred to as Leil Shimurim. It's a night on which we are guarded. There's nothing to fear. Leil hameshumar uba min hamazikin. It is a night in which we are guarded from all destructive forces. Now, both say this manifests itself in a variety of ways. For example, what we right by shvo chamascha, right after we pour the cup of the kos of Elio, what do? We open the door. Why do we open the door? So many different symbolisms, but one of the ideas we open the door to highlight it's Leil Shimurim. It's a night when we have nothing to fear. I can open the door and I am not fearful of opening the door. Right? We see, by the way, we don't say the bracha of Hamapio by Birchos Kriyas Shema, right? By Kriyas Shema Lamita, sorry. Right? Don't say bracha of Hamapio. Right? The bracha of Hamapio is the bracha that's Chosh Baruch Hu guard me from all the destructive forces. Why? Leil Shimurim. We'll say this is the identity of that night. So therefore, first answer is, you're right, under normal circumstances, 4 cups would be a problem, but not on the night of the Seder. Leil Shimurim, no problem of Zugim. So the Gemara says, Rava says, no, this is also different. The 4 cups are different. Why? Kos shabracha mitztaref l'tova, ve'eno mitztaref l'ra. So we'll say, so Rava says like this. Rava says that the third cup, which is benching, is mitztaref lebracha and not mitztaref lera. Now, if you look at the Rashbam, it's the last line of the Rashbam. The Rashbam says Rava Amar Koshal Bracha, Koshal Berkas Hamazon. So it's interesting. The Rashbam understands that the cup that they're referring to over here, the Koshal Bracha, is the cup of benching. So the cup of benching, which is cup number 3 on the night of the Seder, is mitztaref letova, not l'ra. It only combines for good, not for bad. Rashbam says the ra in the mitztaref lahashlim zugos lesakana im shoser v'acharav v'chi agab d'amrina kaman v'yishmerecha the ra v'yishmerecha the ra in the mitztaref. So we'll say the Gemara is going to suggest that no. The third cup is benching. So by definition, since the third cup is benching, it doesn't pose a problem of zugos. Then I will say what's interesting about this is as follows. What's interesting about this is you can make this argument, for the first cup also. The first cup is Kiddush. Right? So the first cup is Kiddush, the third cup is benching. So Pashas, that sounds like what the Gemara is saying. Is that halacha l'may says since at least 2 of the 4 cups over here. Now the truth is you can make the argument that all 4 cups are kos shel bracha, are kos shel mitzvah. But at least again 1 and 3 are benching in Birkas Hamazon. Therefore they don't pose a problem of zugos. So we'll say, so again, answer number 1, zugos aren't a problem because it's Leil Shimurim. Answer number 2, zugos aren't a problem because kos shel mitzvah, kos shel bracha. Next, the Gemara says, Ravina Amar Arba Kasi Takin Rabbanan Derech. So what is this? Ravina says, and this is kind of building on Rava's statement, the rabbis instituted the consumption of 4 cups as derech. This is an expression of freedom. Kol chad v'chad, top of Kuf Yud, mitzvah ba'apei nafshehu. And each cup is its own independent mitzvah. So therefore, again, we'll say, what does this mean? So according to Ravina, he's saying, what does it mean? Each cup has its own independent mitzvah. So take a look at the first Rashbam, Kuf Yod Amad Aleph, ve'ein mitztarfin zelazeh. They don't combine. Now, we'll say, what does it mean they don't combine? There's no problem of zugos. Each cup is looked at as its own independent mitzvah. Zugos is only a problem when you're doing things in pairs. But essentially, I will say, we don't view the 4 cups as 2 cups of 2, right? 2 units of 2. Rather, we view them as 4 units of 1. Now, I will say, this, by the way, is incredibly important because this is a good lamdish machlokes in Arba Kosos. In general, I will say, there's much written about this. Are Arba Kosos 1 mitzvah? Is there 1 mitzvah of Dalat Kosos? Or is there 4 independent mitzvos? Each, right, or the 4 independent 1 cup mitzvah. So we'll say, what's the nafkamina? What's the nafkamina? If you only have 2 cups of wine. What happens if I only have 2 cups? If I only have 2 cups, we'll say, if you have the Dalet Kosos is 1 mitzvah, 1 comprehensive mitzvah made up of 4 parts, well, if you don't have 4 cups, then you don't do the mitzvah. But if you hold that each kos, as Ravina is saying now, is mitzvah ba'apei nafshehu, then even if I only have 2 cups of wine, I do the 2 cups that I can, and at least I fulfilled 2 out of the 4 independent mitzvos. Excuse me. But at least when it comes over here to the zugos issue, so Ravina is going to suggest there's no zugos issue because each cup is reckoned separately and independently. So the Gemara goes weiter. Lo yaset tzrach of trey. A person should not engage in 2 acts of relations, so because of zugos. So the Gemara says, "Amai nimlachu." I don't understand why don't we say that? We'll say a person is nimlach. Nimlach means if a person engages in active relations and then decides to have a second active relations, that's a second decision. That's a second decision. I will say the Rashbam says, in general, if a person has an active relations, they're satisfied. If they then choose to go and have another active relations, that's a new decision. So why do those 2 acts, why are they mitzaref with each other? Why not reckon them separately? To which the Gemara says, Amar Abai Hakikam, that's what it means to say, Lo yochal trei v'yishta trei, v'lo yaset tzracha avilu pam achas dilma chalushu misra. To which the Gemara says, no. What it means is, a person shouldn't eat in pairs. Now, in other words, eat 2 things, go ahead and drink 2 things, and then engage in active relations. Why? Because ultimately, again, dilma chalishu misra. Because then maybe it'll weaken a person and ultimately go ahead and have negative results. So both say the idea is that halacha lamaisa, the Gemara is suggesting that the discussion regarding relations ultimately was not a separate standalone concept, but rather, again, was mentioned after eating and drinking in zugos. So if a person is compromised, so a person is potentially compromised by eating in zugos, drinking in zugos, and then ultimately, again, lo yaset tzrachav, after that, as a fear of ultimately compromising one's safety as a result of the tzrachav after zugos. So we'll stop over here. We'll pick up Emirat Hashem again. So tomorrow's daf is going to be focusing still on the danger of zugos. We'll get a little bit more into the theology of zugos as well. Shkoyach. That's the end. Good morning.